The Kansas River meandered lazily across the golden plain, its waters reflecting the burning summer sun of 1873. On the west bank, Whitefeather attentively watched the movements on the opposite bank, where the Protestant mission stood lonely against the infinite horizon. His dark eyes, sharp as an eagle's, followed the delicate silhouette of Catherine Morrison, who walked between the white sheets spread out on the clothesline. The young Cheyenne warrior was well aware of the risk he was running as he approached the mission. Tensions between her people and the white settlers had intensified in recent months, especially after the arrival of a group of scalp hunters led by the infamous Mason Redfield, a man whose reputation for cruelty was known throughout the territory. Catherine folded the sheets with precise gestures, while her mind wandered to her secret meetings with Whitefeather on the banks of the river. At 20, Reverend William Morrison's daughter carried a heavy responsibility on her shoulders. As the only woman at the mission since her mother's death 3 years earlier, she divided her time between looking after the small infirmary and helping with lessons for the local children. Catherine. Reverend Morrison's deep voice echoed across the courtyard. "Come here, my child." She hurried towards the entrance to the mission where her father was talking to 2 men on horses. One of them was Mason Redfield, his stained leather hat and unshaven beard, giving him a wild appearance that made Catherine shudder. "Miss Morrison!" Redfield tipped his hat in an exaggerated manner. "I was just telling your father about the savages who are prowling the area. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be wandering around alone." Across the river, Whitefeather clenched his fists at the interaction. He knew well the reputation of Redfield and his men, who hunted his people like animals selling scalps for money. The warrior knew he needed to be even more cautious in his encounters with Catherine. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Redfield," Catherine replied coolly, "but I assure you, I can take care of myself." Reverend Morrison sniffed, visibly uncomfortable. "Mason has brought us some worrying news, daughter. It seems there are rumors of a disease spreading among the northern tribes." Catherine felt her heart squeeze. Her experience in the Everyo mission infirmary had made her aware of how devastating white diseases could be for the natives. Her thoughts immediately flew to Panabranca and his tribe. "The only good Indians are dead Indians," laughed Redfield's companion, a thin man with scars on his face. "That disease will save us the trouble." The cruel remark made Catherine feel nauseous. She watched the men leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Her father put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know your heart is kind, Catherine, but you need to understand that the world is more complex than it seems. There is a lot of hatred and violence in these lands." At night, when the full moon illuminated the river with its silvery light, Catherine quietly slipped away from the mission. She knew every creaking floorboard, every shadow that could give away her presence. The meeting place was a small grove of poplars protected from the mission's view by a bend in the river. Whitefeather was already waiting for her, his tall, proud silhouette cut out against the starry sky. He welcomed her into his arms with a kindness that few would have thought possible in a warrior of his reputation. "I heard about the illness," Catherine whispered against his chest. "Is it true?" "My people are worried," he replied, his deep voice carrying the weight of concern. "The elders speak of bad signs. The sacred waters in the mountains may hold the cure, but the journey is dangerous." "The mountains," Catherine pulled away to look into his eyes. "But Redfield's men patrol that region. It would be suicide." "My people need me." Whitefeather gently touched Catherine's cheek. "And so will you, if the disease reaches the mission." The distant sound of horses' hooves made them separate quickly. Catherine felt the familiar fear tighten in her chest. Fear of being discovered. Fear of what would happen if her father found out. Fear of losing Whitefeather to the violence that seemed to engulf all things in that wild land. "Tomorrow," he whispered, already moving silently between the shadows, "when the sun touches the water." Catherine watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart torn between the love she felt and the weight of the circumstances that separated them. On the horizon, dark clouds were beginning to form, foreshadowing a storm that seemed to reflect the turbulence to come. Back at the mission, lying on her narrow bed, Catherine thought about Whitefeather's words about the sacred waters. She knew in her heart that he would set off in search of a cure, regardless of the dangers. It was part of who he was, a warrior who put the needs of his people before his own. The wind began to blow harder, making the windows of the mission groan. Catherine pulled the blanket up to her chin, her silent prayers mingling with the howl of the wind on the plains. She prayed for Whitefeather, for her people, and for the strength to face the days ahead. In the darkness of her room, she swore that she would do whatever it took to protect those she loved, even if it meant defying everything she had been raised to believe. The next morning, news of the epidemic was already spreading through the mission, like fire through dry grass. Reverend Morrison gathered the few locals in the small wooden chapel, his words echoing against the rustic walls as Catherine organized the medical supplies, trying not to show her growing concern. "We must prepare," declared the Reverend, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "If the disease reaches us, we need to be ready to help both our own and the natives who seek help." A murmur of discontent ran through the small congregation. Mrs. Peterson, wife of the local merchant, stood up indignantly. "With all due respect, Reverend, but we can't risk our own families by allowing sick savages near the mission." Catherine squeezed the vial of laudanum she was holding tightly, holding back the urge to reply. Her father, sensing her agitation, raised his hand in a calming gesture. "Christ taught us to love our fellow human beings, Mrs. Peterson. We will make no distinction between those who need help." Outside the chapel, the sky was heavy with storms. Catherine took advantage of the moment of discussion to slip out discreetly, her heart racing, as the time agreed with Whitefeather approached. The heavy, humid air clung to her skin as she made her way to the river carrying a basket of medical supplies that she had secretly sorted. Whitefeather was already waiting for her at the usual spot, but this time he wasn't alone. A tribal elder whom Catherine recognized as Walking Bear was with him. The old shaman studied her with penetrating eyes that seemed to see into her soul. "I brought what I could." Catherine held out the basket. "Quinine bandages, medicinal herbs. It's not much, but it might help." Walking Bear took the basket with hands wrinkled by time. "Your heart is good, daughter of the man who speaks with the Great Spirit, but what we face is older than your remedies." "Has the disease reached the village?" asked Catherine, noticing the tension in Whitefeather's shoulders. 3 children fell ill yesterday," replied the warrior, his deep voice laden with concern. "The symptoms are like nothing we've ever seen. The fever burns like fire, but they shiver as if they were in the harshest winter." The shaman took out a small leather bag from his robes and pulled out a handful of reddish earth. "The sacred waters in the mountains hold healing, but the path is protected by ancient spirits, and few have returned to tell the tale." "What about Redfield's men?" Catherine couldn't contain the question that tormented her. "They're like coyotes." Whitefeather frowned. "They hunt in packs and attack the weak. But a Cheyenne warrior can move like the wind." A distant clap of thunder made Catherine shudder. Walking Bear raised his face to the sky, his eyes narrowing. "The spirits are restless. The journey must begin before the new moon appears in the sky." 3 days, calculated Whitefeather, exchanging a meaningful glance with Catherine. I'll need more supplies, she decided, her determination growing. And information on the movements of Redfield and his men. The shaman watched her with renewed interest. Do you intend to help our warrior in his quest? Not directly, Catherine replied, already formulating a plan. But I can be his eyes and ears here. The scalp hunters trust my father and frequent the mission. Whitefeather touched her arm gently. It's dangerous. If they find out. No more dangerous than your journey to the mountains, she retorted, covering his hand with her own. The first raindrops began to fall fat and heavy, marking the dry earth. Walking Bear put away the leather bag and made a gesture of blessing in Catherine's direction. The Great Spirit has put strength in your spirit, young flower. But remember, some secrets have sharp teeth. With these enigmatic words, the shaman disappeared between the trees with surprising agility for his age. Catherine and Whitefeather remained silent for a moment, the rain intensifying around them. I need to get back, she whispered at last. But I'll bring you more information tomorrow. Mason Redfield should show up at the mission to discuss the patrols with my father. Whitefeather nodded, his dark eyes fixed on hers. Be careful, Catherine. Redfield has a heart as black as coal and eyes as watchful as ever. Before she could reply, he pulled her into an urgent, desperate kiss, as if trying to save the taste of her lips for the journey ahead. The rain was now coming down, in full force, drenching them, but neither of them cared. When they finally separated, Catherine ran back to the mission, her wet dress clinging to her body. She was just in time to see 3 riders approaching from the main road, Mason Redfield, and 2 of his men, their shadowy silhouettes jagged against the stormy sky. Hiding behind a pile of firewood, Catherine watched the men dismount. Her heart was racing, not only because of her recent encounter with Whitefeather, but also because she was aware of the dangerous role she had decided to play. The rain continued to fall, washing away the traces of their forbidden adventure, while thunder rumbled in the distance as an omen of what was to come. Catherine knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Now her loyalties were divided between her father and his faith, and the man who had captured her heart with the force of a hurricane on the Kansas plains. The next morning dawned with a dense fog covering the mission, as if nature itself was conspiring to conceal the secrets that were multiplying on their land. Catherine watched through the infirmary window as Mason Redfield and his men talked to her father in the courtyard, their voices muffled by the distance. Patrols will be stepped up to the north. She could make out Redfield's rough voice. Those savages won't be able to hide for long, especially with this disease weakening them. Catherine pretended to organize the medicine bottles, but her ears were tuned to every word. Her heart ached at the thought of Whitefeather and the perilous journey he would soon face. "What about the mountains?" asked one of Redfield's men, a scarred fellow known as Snake. "I've heard that the Indians consider that region sacred." "That's exactly why we're going to concentrate our search there," replied Redfield, his cruel smile visible even from a distance. "If they're sick, that's where they'll run." Catherine felt her blood run cold. She needed to warn Whitefeather about the scalp hunter's plans, but how could she do it without arousing suspicion? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the infirmary opened, and Mason Redfield walked in, his hat in hand, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Morrison," he greeted, coming closer than etiquette would allow. "I've come to see if you have any medical supplies to sell. Patrol work can be risky." "Of course, Mr. Redfield," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. "What precisely are you looking for?" As she sorted through bandages and dyes, Catherine realized that Redfield was watching her with disturbing intensity. He moved even closer, his tobacco breath making her stomach turn. "You know, miss, a beautiful woman like you shouldn't be wasting her talents at this end of the world," he said lightly, touching a lock of her hair. "I'll soon be a rich man with all those hunting contracts. I could give you a much better life." Catherine stepped back, her hand instinctively clenching the bottle she held. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Redfield, but I'm very satisfied with my life here." "Are you?" He arched an eyebrow. "Are you sure there's nothing keeping you here apart from filial duty?" The insinuating tone in his voice made Catherine freeze. Was it possible that he knew something about her meetings with White Feather? Before she could answer, Reverend Morrison's voice sounded from the doorway. "Catherine, I need your help with the mission records." Redfield stepped aside, putting his hat back on. "Think about what I said, miss. Times are changing, and it's best to be on the right side of history." After he left, Catherine needed a few minutes to regain her composure. Redfield's veiled threats and the imminent danger to Whitefeather weighed on her shoulders like lead. She knew she had to act quickly. At dusk, taking advantage of a moment when her father was busy preparing for Sunday service, Catherine escaped towards the river. On the way, she met a young Cheyenne woman who occasionally visited the mission to trade furs for supplies. "New moon," Catherine called softly. The girl turned her dark eyes, revealing recognition. "I need you to take a message to Whitefeather." In hurried whispers, Catherine explained about Redfield's plans for the mountains. New Moon listened intently, her young face marked by concern. "The spirits will guide our warrior," replied the young native. "But there's another problem. More children have fallen ill in the village." Catherine bit her lip thoughtfully. "I can sort out more medicine, but we need to be discreet. Redfield is suspecting something. He has the eyes of a snake." New Moon frowned. "Always watching, always waiting to strike." The two agreed on a safe place to exchange supplies, and New Moon left as silently as a shadow among the trees. Catherine returned to the mission, her mind working furiously on a plan to protect Whitefeather and her people. Over dinner, Reverend Morrison noticed his daughter's restlessness. "Is everything all right, Catherine? You've barely touched your food." "I'm just worried about the epidemic, Dad," she replied, trying to sound casual. "We don't have enough supplies if the disease spreads." "Mason Redfield offered to bring medicine from the city," her father commented, studying her reaction. "He seems to have a special interest in you, daughter." Catherine forced a smile. "Mr. Redfield confuses interest with ownership, Dad. I have no intention of becoming anyone's property." The Reverend sighed, putting down his cutlery. "I only want your happiness and safety, Catherine. Ever since your mother left, you've been carrying a heavy burden for someone so young." Her father's words touched her deeply, increasing her guilt for keeping so many secrets from him. But how could she explain that her heart belonged to a Cheyenne warrior? How could she make him understand that love did not know the barriers that men built? That night, while the mission slept, Catherine worked by candlelight, carefully separating medicines and herbs into small packages that she could discreetly deliver to New Moon. Her heart was torn between her duty to her father and the mission and the love she felt for Whitefeather. Through the window, the crescent moon illuminated the plains with its silvery light. In 2 days, it would be new, and Whitefeather would set off on her perilous journey. Catherine closed her eyes and whispered a prayer not to her father's deities, but to the ancient spirits that Whitefeather had taught her to respect. "Protect him," she murmured to the night. "Bring him back to me." The night wind carried her prayer across the Kansas plains while the stars shone like silent witnesses to a love that defied all boundaries. On the eve of the new moon, the tension in the mission was palpable, like the heavy air before a storm. Catherine had spent the last 2 days dividing herself between her usual duties and the secret preparations to help Whitefeather on her journey. Through New Moon, she had managed to send not only medicine, but also vital information about the patrol routes of Redfield's men. The afternoon sun was beginning to decline when Catherine heard the sound of approaching hooves. From the infirmary window, she saw Snake Redfield's scarred man arriving with 2 more scalp hunters. Their faces were covered in dust, and their expressions were grim. "We found signs of them in the eastern hills," Catherine heard Snake say to her father. "They seem to be moving towards the mountains, just as Mason predicted." Reverend Morrison rubbed his forehead worriedly. "What about the sick? Have you seen any signs of the epidemic?" "We found 2 bodies," replied one of the other men, his voice laced with contempt. "We left them there. It's not worth risking catching this plague just for a few scalps." Catherine felt her stomach turn at the casual cruelty of these men. She needed to find a way to warn Whitefeather about the hunter's proximity, but how could she do it without arousing suspicion? The opportunity arose when his father announced that he would be holding a special service at dusk asking for prayers for the containment of the epidemic. While everyone was heading to the chapel, Catherine managed to escape on the pretext of fetching more candles from the storeroom. Running across the high field that separated the mission from the river, she reached the meeting point, agreed with New Moon. The young Cheyenne was already waiting for her, her black tresses decorated with hawk feathers. "Whitefeather will leave tonight," whispered New Moon, her dark eyes shining with urgency. "The signs are favorable, and the new moon will hide his footsteps." "Redfield's men are close," Catherine replied, her words hurried. "They know about the movement towards the mountains. Tell him to take the West Pass, it's longer, but the patrols don't know that route." New Moon nodded, but her young face was marked by worry. 3 more have died in the village since yesterday. The elders say the spirits are furious at the presence of white men on sacred land. Catherine felt the weight of guilt in her chest, guilt for being the daughter of invaders, for being part of the people who brought so much death and destruction. But before she could reply, a distant cry cut through the air. "Miss Morrison!" It was Snake's voice. Catherine pushed New Moon towards the trees. "Go, hurry up, I'll distract him." As the young Cheyenne disappeared silently into the vegetation, Catherine ran back towards the mission, her heart pounding wildly. She found Snake near the warehouse, his face marked by a suspicious expression. "What were you doing out there alone, miss? Don't you know it's dangerous?" "I was looking for medicinal herbs," she replied, showing him a handful of plants she had preventively picked earlier. "With so many sick people, we need to prepare." Snake studied her for a moment, his eyes as cold as a snake's. "You know Mason won't like it at all when he finds out you're taking risks like this. He has plans for you." "Mr. Redfield has no right over my movements," Catherine replied firmly, although her heart was racing. "Not yet," Snake smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "But he soon will. He always gets what he wants." Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine, but kept her composure as she walked back to the chapel. The service had already begun, the voices of the faithful rising in a melancholy prayer that echoed across the plain. As her father led the sermon, Catherine let her mind wander back to Whitefeather. That very night, he would begin his perilous journey to the sacred mountains. How many dangers awaited him on the way? Would she ever see him again? After the service, while helping to put away the hymnals, Catherine was surprised by Mason Redfield, who emerged from the shadows like a predator. "A perfect night for hunting. Don't you think, Miss Morrison?" he commented, coming closer. "No moon to reveal our secrets." "I have no secrets, Mr. Redfield," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. "No," He arched an eyebrow, taking a lock of her hair between his fingers. "Snake told me he saw you running through the fields like a savage. I wonder what a decent girl like you would be doing out alone at dusk." Catherine took a step back, her heart thundering in her chest. "As I explained to your man, I was gathering medicinal herbs. If you'll excuse me." Redfield blocked her path, his smile now completely devoid of any kindness. "You know what happens to people who help savages, don't you? Even pretty girls like you can be considered traitors." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Redfield?" "Just a friendly warning," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a mocking gesture. "After all, it would be a shame if something happened to the Reverend's daughter, wouldn't it?" Catherine watched him go, her legs shaking so badly that she had to lean on the chapel wall. Redfield's veiled threats echoed in her mind, mingling with her concern for Whitefeather. That night, alone in her room, Catherine knelt by the window. The sky was black as coal, with no stars or moon to light the Cheyenne warrior's path. Her prayers were mingling now, Christian words intertwined with invocations to the ancient spirits that Whitefeather had taught her to respect. "Protect him," she whispered into the darkness. "Guide his steps through the shadows, and bring him back safe and sound." The night wind carried her prayer across the Kansas plains, while somewhere in the vastness of the night a lone warrior began his journey in search of the cure that could save his people. The new moon was hiding in the sky when Whitefeather began his journey towards the sacred mountains. With only a small bundle of provisions and the medicines provided by Catherine, the Cheyenne warrior moved like a shadow across the prairie, his steps as silent as those of a cougar. At the mission, Catherine remained awake, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Mason Redfield's veiled warning still echoed in her ears, but her greatest concern was for Whitefeather and the perilous journey he had just begun. Dawn brought with it an unusual bustle. 3 riders arrived at the mission even before breakfast, their sweat-covered horses indicating a long, hurried ride. "Reverend Morrison," called one of them, dismounting quickly. "We have urgent news from the fort. The epidemic has spread north, and the commander is requisitioning all available medical supplies." Catherine, watching from the infirmary door, felt her heart squeeze. With the medicines she had secretly sent to the Whitefeather tribe, her stocks were already dangerously low. "Catherine," her father called out, "please check what we can make available." Zeit. While sorting through the few remaining medicines, Catherine overheard the men talking about troop movements and rumors of conflicts with the natives. Apparently, some northern tribes were refusing to stay on their designated reservations, preferring to risk escape rather than wait to die from the disease. "Mason Redfield and his men left at dawn," commented one of the riders. "He said he had information about a large group moving towards the mountains." The flask Catherine was holding almost slipped out of her hands. Had Redfield left? So soon was he following Whitefeather's trail. "Miss Morrison!" Snake's voice sounded from the infirmary door, startling her. She hadn't seen him coming. "Mason asked me to give you this before he left." He held out a small paper parcel. With trembling fingers, Catherine opened it, revealing a single eagle feather stained red, a clear warning of what would happen if she continued to help the Cheyenne. "He also said he'll be back in a few days to have a serious talk with your father." Snake added his mischievous grin, revealing that he knew exactly what the threat meant. As soon as Snake left, Catherine ran to find New Moon. The young Cheyenne often hid near the stream that fed the mission's vegetable garden, waiting for news or instructions. "I need you to take a message to the village," Catherine whispered hurriedly. "Redfield left early for the mountains. He may be following Whitefeather's trail." New Moon nodded gravely. The elders performed protection rituals before their departure. The spirits will guide his steps. But what if that's not enough? Catherine's voice shook. Redfield is an experienced hunter, and he knows that territory well. Whitefeather is smarter than the white man, New Moon replied with conviction. He can read the signs of the earth and sky. The Great Spirit will protect him. When Catherine returned to the mission, she found her father in a heated discussion with the fort's knights about the distribution of medicines. We can't just abandon the natives to their fate, argued Reverend Morrison. They are as much children of God as we are. With all due respect, Reverend, replied one of the men, but our own families need this medicine. And the Indians only have this disease because they refuse to live on the reservations as they should. Catherine watched the discussion with a lump in her throat, aware that every moment lost could mean more lives taken by the epidemic. Her thoughts turned to Whitefeather alone, in the vast wilderness, carrying with him the hope of his people. In the afternoon, dark clouds began to form on the horizon, promising a storm. Catherine was organizing the infirmary when she heard shouts coming from the courtyard. A family of settlers had arrived carrying a feverish child in their arms. The fever started yesterday, explained the mother, her cheeks streaked with tears. It's just like the stories we heard about the Indians being sick. Reverend Morrison exchanged a worried glance with Catherine. The epidemic was getting closer, and their resources were increasingly scarce. While caring for the sick child, Catherine couldn't help thinking about how many lives depended on the success of Whitefeather's mission. The journey to the sacred mountains was dangerous even in normal times. With Redfield and his men on her trail, every step could be a death trap. The storm finally arrived at dusk, bringing with it howling winds that rattled the mission's windows. Catherine remained by the sick child's side, applying cold compresses to his forehead, while whispering prayers both for her little patient's recovery and for Whitefeather's safety. "You have a gift for this daughter," commented her father, watching her from the doorway. "Your mother would be proud." Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if she would approve of my choices, Dad." Reverend Morrison approached, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your mother always said that God's love knows no bounds. She believed that our mission was to help everyone in need, regardless of where they came from." His father's words struck a deep chord in his heart. If he knew the true extent of her choices, her love for Whitefeather, her secret participation in her dangerous mission, would he still speak so fondly? A particularly loud clap of thunder shook the mission, and the sick child stirred in his feverish sleep. Outside, the storm roared like a wild beast, and Catherine couldn't help but think of Whitefeather facing not only the elements, but also Redfield's relentless pursuit. "May God protect all travelers on a night like this," murmured Reverend Morrison, making the sign of the cross. Catherine closed her eyes, adding her own silent prayer to the spirits of earth and sky, imploring them to guard the steps of the man she loved through the dark trails that awaited him. The storm that punished the mission was just a foretaste of the chaos to come. The next morning, Catherine awoke to the sound of horses rushing towards her. Through the fogged-up window, she saw one of Redfield's men, drenched and covered in mud, dismounting in the courtyard. "We found fresh tracks," he shouted to Snake, who emerged from the staff house. "Mason wants reinforcements. Looks like our Cheyenne warrior isn't alone." Catherine felt her heart race. Had other members of the tribe decided to accompany Whitefeather on his journey, or were they just false trails to confuse the pursuers? The sick child they had received the day before was getting worse by the hour. His mother, Sarah Collins, watched with red eyes as Catherine changed the compresses on his feverish forehead. "They say the Indians have powerful medicines in the mountains," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Is that true?" Catherine hesitated before answering, aware that Snake was still nearby. "There are many stories about ancient cures, Mrs. Collins, but now we have to rely on the methods we know." Outside, the movement increased. More men arrived, preparing to reinforce the search for White Feather. Catherine watched them with a mixture of fear and anger, knowing that every minute lost meant more lives at risk, both at the mission and in the Cheyenne village. "Catherine," her father called out from the infirmary. Dore, his face marked with concern. "I need you to go to the Peterson trading post. They received a shipment of quinine yesterday." "Now, Dad, with all this movement, it's our best chance." He lowered his voice. "And maybe you can find out more about these men's plans. Something's not right about this chase." Catherine sensed the wisdom in her father's words. Reverend Morrison might not have known about her relationship with Whitefeather, but his years of experience had made him perceptive about the men's intentions. Mounting her horse, Catherine rode across the muddy prairie towards the trading post. The sky was still heavy, threatening more rain. On the way, she found New Moon hiding among the bushes. "The storm spirits protected Whitefeather," whispered the young Cheyenne. "The rain erased many of his tracks, but Redfield is as persistent as a hungry coyote." "Has he found any other warriors?" "No." New Moon shook her head. "The extra tracks are tricks that Walking Bear taught him. Whitefeather travels alone, but he makes it look like there are many." At the trading post, Catherine encountered an unusual commotion. Mrs. Peterson was arguing heatedly with two of Redfield's men about the price of supplies. "If you want extra ammunition, you'll have to pay the fair price," she insisted, her eyes hard as stones. "I don't care if it's for hunting Indians or buffalo." While waiting her turn, Catherine picked up fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Apparently, Redfield wasn't just after scalps. There were rumors of gold in the sacred mountains, and he planned to use the chase as an excuse to explore the region. "Miss Morrison," Mrs. Peterson called after the men. "Did your father send for the quinine?" "Yes, ma'am. We have a very sick child at the mission." The shopkeeper studied Catherine for a moment before bending over the counter, lowering her voice. "Be careful, miss. Redfield has been spreading stories about you, saying that you're very interested in Indian affairs." Catherine kept her face impassive, although her heart was pounding. "I just follow the Christian teachings of helping all those in need, Mrs. Peterson." "There's a difference between Christian charity and treason in the eyes of these men," the older woman warned, handing her a packet of medicines. "And Redfield is not known for his mercy." On the way back to the mission, the rain started again, first in thin drops, and then in heavy curtains that made it difficult to see. Catherine took the opportunity to make a detour, leaving coded messages at the points she had agreed with New Moon, warnings about Redfield's true objective, and the need for Whitefeather to avoid the routes closest to the supposed gold deposits. When he finally returned, he found two more families arriving at the mission with sick people. The epidemic was spreading rapidly, and the few medicines they had would not be enough for long. "We need help from the fort," his father declared over dinner, his voice tired. "We can't deal with this on our own." "The fort is more concerned with chasing ghosts in the mountains than saving lives." Catherine couldn't contain her bitter comment. Reverend Morrison studied his daughter carefully. "Do you know something I should know, Catherine?" Before she could answer, shouts from the courtyard interrupted them. It was Snake returning with news of Redfield. "We found signs of a recent camp near the pass," he announced to the other men gathered around. "Mason thinks we can reach them before they reach the mountains." Catherine felt her heart squeeze. The pass was precisely the route she had suggested to Whitefeather through New Moon. Had she inadvertently led him into a trap? That night, while tending to the sick in the crowded infirmary, Catherine struggled with the weight of guilt and fear. Every thunderclap that rattled the windows sounded like a distant gunshot. Every shadow could be a sign that White Feather had been captured. "You love him, don't you?" Sarah Collins's weak voice surprised her. The woman watched Catherine with feverish but perceptive eyes. "The Indian you're looking for. You love him." Catherine froze, the wet cloth dripping into her trembling hands. "Mrs. Collins." "Don't worry." Sarah coughed, a faint smile on her cracked lips. "I've also loved someone the world said I shouldn't have. Sometimes the heart chooses paths that reason doesn't understand." Silent tears streamed down Catherine's face as she continued her care of the sick. Outside, the storm roared like a wild beast, and somewhere in the dark expanses, White Feather fought not only against the elements, but against men whose hearts were colder than winter itself. Dawn brought a brief lull in the storm, but the tension on the mission remained as thick as the mist that covered the plains. Catherine had barely slept, torn between caring for the sick and worrying about White Feather's fate. "There's movement in the hills." The cry came from young Tommy Peterson, the merchant's son, who had arrived panting at the mission. Redfield's men found an abandoned camp. There was blood on the site. Catherine felt her legs weaken, but kept her composure as she continued to administer medication to the patients. Sarah Collins, still burning up, held her hand with surprising strength. "Don't give up hope," whispered the sick woman. "Sometimes blood is just bait to throw off the hunters." Sarah's wit surprised Catherine. How could she know so much about indigenous warfare tactics? Before she could ask, Snake entered the infirmary, his face marked by a cruel smile. "Mason sent some interesting news, Miss Morrison," he announced, stepping dangerously close. "Looks like your Indian friend left a pretty clear trail this time. Maybe he's too wounded to hide properly." Catherine forced herself to continue her work, feigning disinterest. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Snake. My only concern is my patients." "Is that so?" He laughed, picking up one of the medicine bottles and twirling it between his fingers. "Then why did we find several of these mission vials in the abandoned camp?" Catherine's heart almost stopped, but years of practice in hiding her feelings helped her keep her expression neutral. "As you may know, we distribute medicines to all those in need. It's our Christian duty." Snake put the bottle back on the shelf with excessive force. "Mason won't like it one bit, knowing that his precious medicines are being wasted on savages." As soon as he left, Catherine ran to find New Moon in her usual hiding place. The young Cheyenne was already waiting for her, her normally serene face marked by concern. "The rain spirits protected White Feather," New Moon whispered. "The blood in the camp was from a deer. He left false clues to confuse the scalp." "Hunters!" Catherine let out a sigh of relief. "But they found the drugs. Snake suspects me." "Walking Bear saw this coming," New Moon replied, pulling a small amulet from her robes. "He sent this for your protection. It's eagle bones and sacred herbs. It will confuse the thoughts of those who wish to harm you." Catherine accepted the amulet, gratefully hiding it in the pocket of her apron. On returning to the mission, she found her father in a heated argument with two representatives of the fort. "We can't just ignore the epidemic," Reverend Morrison argued. "While you're chasing ghosts in the mountains, people are dying." "With all due respect, Reverend," replied one of the men, "we have direct orders from the governor. There are suspicions that the Indians are using stolen gold to buy weapons. We need to stop them before they organize a revolt." Catherine almost laughed at the irony. The real gold that White Feather was after was ancestral healing knowledge, not the nuggets that Redfield and his men coveted. In the afternoon, more sick people arrived at the mission. The epidemic was spreading fast, and the few medicines left were barely enough for a few days. Catherine watched the horizon through the infirmary window, praying that Whitefeather would find a cure in time. "You need to leave." Sarah Collins spoke suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "You need to find him before Redfield does." "What are you talking about, Mrs. Collins?" "My first husband was Cherokee." Sarah revealed her eyes shining with fever and old memories. "I know how to recognize the look of someone torn between two worlds. You have to choose your path before others choose it for you." Catherine sat down next to the woman's bed, her hands trembling slightly. "How can I abandon my father? The sick? Sometimes we need to lose something to save something greater." Sarah coughed, her strength waning. "Your warrior doesn't just seek a cure for his people. He seeks a cure for all of us. But he won't succeed alone, not with Redfield and his men on his trail." The sound of approaching hooves interrupted the conversation. Catherine ran to the window and saw Mason Redfield himself arriving at the mission, his face marked by an expression she knew well, the expression of a predator who believes he has cornered his prey. "Miss Morrison!" his voice thundered across the courtyard. "I need a word with you and your father." Catherine felt the new moon amulet burn in her pocket. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. It was time to choose between filial duty and the love that could save not only Whitefeather, but all those suffering under the scourge of the epidemic. "Go," Sarah whispered. "Go while there's still time." Heart pounding, Catherine grabbed her medicine bag and a small map she had secretly prepared marking the least guarded routes to the mountains. Through the back door of the infirmary, she could hear Redfield's voice getting closer, mixed in with her father's protests. "God forgive me," she murmured, kissing Sarah's feverish forehead before slipping out of the back window. The sun was beginning to set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold as Catherine Morrison, the Reverend's daughter and keeper of secrets as deep as the Kansas River itself, disappeared into the growing shadows of the prairie, leaving behind everything she knew in pursuit of a love that could change the fate of two peoples. Dusk covered the Kansas plains as Catherine galloped towards the mountains, her heart torn between the guilt of abandoning her father and the urgency of finding Whitefeather. The horse she had borrowed from the mission was young and strong, but she knew she had to be careful not to exhaust him too early in the journey. Behind her, excited voices echoed from the mission. Redfield had surely already discovered their escape. Catherine clutched the amulet that New Moon had given her, praying that its protection would go beyond superstition. The makeshift map she carried showed alternative routes through less patrolled territories, but the risk of running into Redfield's men was still great. "There she is!" A shout cut through the rising night air. Catherine recognized Snake's voice and reined in her horse, plunging into a small wood she knew well from her secret meetings with Whitefeather. The sound of pursuing hooves made her veer even further west, where the rough terrain would make pursuit difficult. The growing darkness was both her ally and her enemy. If on the one hand it concealed her escape, on the other, it made navigation more risky. "You can't run forever, Miss Morrison," Redfield's voice thundered across the prairie. "Think of your father, what this will do to his reputation." The words hit Catherine like arrows, but she didn't slow down. Sarah Collins was right. Sometimes you had to lose something to save something greater. Her father would have to understand, even if it meant never being able to come home again. Night had fully set in when Catherine finally allowed her horse to slow down. The sounds of pursuit had ceased, but she didn't dare light a torch to consult the map. The stars would have to be her guide, as Whitefeather had taught her during their nightly conversations. "The star spirits always show the way," she murmured, remembering his words as she searched for the constellation the Cheyenne used to find their way around. A distant howl made her shudder. It wasn't just wolves and coyotes she needed to fear. The plains were full of bandits and scalp hunters who wouldn't hesitate to attack a woman alone. Dawn found her near a stream, where she decided to make a brief stop. While her horse drank, Catherine examined the map in the light of the rising day. If her calculations were correct, Whitefeather should be following the route through the western gorge, avoiding the more obvious paths to the sacred mountains. "You're braver than you look, Miss Morrison." The voice made Catherine turn quickly, her heart almost stopping at the sight of one of Redfield's men emerging from the bushes. It was Pete Wilson, one of the youngest hunters in the group. "Pete, please." Catherine raised her hands slowly. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" he asked, approaching with his rifle pointed at the ground. "Stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life, or let you ruin everything. Your father built because of a savage." "You don't understand," she replied, backing discreetly towards her horse. "It's not just about Whitefeather. People are dying, Pete. Children. The cure in the sacred mountains could save us all." Pete hesitated, and Catherine saw something in his eyes, doubt, perhaps even understanding. He was too young to be as hard-hearted as Redfield and Snake. "Mason will kill me if I let you go," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "He doesn't need to know." Catherine took advantage of his hesitation. "Tell him I lost you in the darkness, that I went north instead of west." The young hunter ran a hand over his tired face, clearly torn. "Do you really believe there is a cure, that it's worth risking everything for?" "I believe it's worth risking everything to save lives," she replied firmly. "It doesn't matter if they're white or Indian. All lives have value in God's eyes." Pete lowered the rifle completely, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "Go on. Follow the stream to the 3 rocks that look like fingers pointing to the sky. From there, take the path of the setting sun. It's the safest route to the mountains." Catherine felt tears of gratitude well up in her eyes. "Thank you, Pete. God bless you." "Just be careful," he warned as she mounted. "Redfield isn't the only danger in these parts." "And Catherine." She stopped to look at him. "Pray that our paths don't cross again. I won't be able to help you a second time." With a final nod, Catherine set off at a gallop, following Pete's instructions. The sun was rising over the horizon, promising another scorching day on the Kansas plains. Somewhere ahead of them, Whitefeather was continuing his own journey, and she prayed that their paths would cross before Redfield caught up with them. The words of Sarah Collins echoed in her mind as she rode, "Sometimes you have to lose something to save something greater." Catherine had lost her home, her reputation, perhaps even her father's love. But as she guided her horse towards the distant mountains, she knew she had chosen the right path. The warm wind from the plains dried the last tears on her face, while the new moon amulet tapped gently against her chest, reminding her that she was not alone on her journey. The spirits of Whitefeather's ancestors watched over her, guiding her. Steps through a land that did not forgive the weak or the indecisive. And so Catherine Morrison, the Reverend's daughter, who dared to defy the conventions of her time for the sake of love and justice, rode towards her destiny, leaving behind the world she knew in search of a greater truth that could unite 2 peoples divided by prejudice and fear. The 3rd day of the journey brought with it a stifling heat that made the air shiver over the parched plains. Catherine kept a steady pace, alternating between riding and walking to spare her horse. The sacred mountains were no longer just distant. Shadows on the horizon, their rocky slopes rose imposingly in front of them, guarding ancient secrets in their protected valleys. The new moon amulet had proved more valuable than Catherine had first imagined. Twice she had managed to avoid patrols of scalp hunters, feeling an inexplicable urge to hide moments before they appeared. It was as if the spirits really were guiding her, as Whitefeather had always said they did. "There are signs everywhere," she muttered to herself, remembering the lessons her beloved had shared during their secret meetings. You just have to know where to look. And the signs were there, branches broken in a specific way. Small piles of stones that would look natural to the untrained eye, but which Catherine recognized as markers left by Whitefeather. He knew she was coming even before she decided to leave herself. The distant sound of gunfire brought her to an abrupt halt. They were coming from the direction of the mountains, echoing between the peaks like thunder. Catherine felt her heart. Squeeze Redfield must have found a more concrete clue to Whitefeather's whereabouts. "Come on, boy," she whispered to her horse, guiding him down a steeper path that snaked between the rocks. "We need to get there, before they do." As they climbed, the air became thinner and colder. Catherine pulled the shawl she had brought tighter around her shoulders, silently thanking herself for having thought to bring warmer clothes. The stories Whitefeather had told about the sacred mountains spoke of sudden changes in temperature and storms that came out of nowhere. A sudden movement among the rocks made her stop. For a terrifying moment, Catherine thought she had been discovered by one of Redfield's men. But then a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Walking Bear, the old shaman. "The spirits said you would come," he spoke in his broken English. "The heart of the daughter of the man who speaks with the Great Spirit is as strong as the mountain wind." "Where is Whitefeather?" Catherine asked quickly, dismounting. "We heard gunshots." "The young warrior follows the path of the sacred waters," the shaman replied, his ancient eyes fixed on the slopes above. "Redfield and his men are going the wrong way, chasing shadows and echoes." Catherine felt a momentary sense of relief, but knew they couldn't waste any time. "The epidemic is getting worse at the mission. More people were arriving when I left." Walking Bear nodded gravely. "The disease is like a fire that spreads with the wind. But the sacred waters hold secrets older than the disease itself." He removed a small leather bag from his robes. "Here, these are herbs for strength. The road ahead is difficult." As she chewed the bitter herbs the shaman had given her, Catherine heard more shots, this time from further away. Walking Bear seemed unperturbed, as if the sounds of violence were just another natural element of the mountain. "Why does Redfield want to find Whitefeather so badly?" she asked, although she suspected the answer. "The black-hearted man seeks gold," the shaman replied with contempt. "He believes that our people hide riches in the sacred mountains. He doesn't understand that the real treasure lies in the healing waters, in the knowledge passed down through generations." An icy wind blew between the rocks, bringing with it the smell of rain. Catherine looked up at the sky where dark clouds were beginning to form with surprising rapidity. "The storm is coming to clear the path," Walking Bear declared. "Follow the hawk's trail when the waters of the sky stop. Whitefeather will wait in the valley of the Three Sisters." "How do I know which valley?" Catherine asked. But the shaman had already disappeared among the rocks as silently as he had appeared. The rain started a few minutes later, first in thick, sparse drops, then turning into a curtain of water that made it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. Catherine found shelter under a rocky ledge, taking the opportunity to rest and share her last supplies with the exhausted horse. While she waited for the storm to pass, her thoughts turned to her father and the mission. How would Reverend Morrison cope with his departure? Would he ever understand his reasons? And the sick, how many more would have arrived seeking help? The rain subsided as suddenly as it had started, leaving the air clear and cold. A hawk cut through the sky with a sharp cry, and Catherine remembered the shaman's words. Mounting again, she followed the direction of the bird's flight, her heart beating harder with every step that brought her closer to White Feather. The Valley of the Three Sisters revealed itself a few hours later, 3 rocky peaks rising side by side like ancient sentinels guarding a verdant valley between them. And there, next to a small waterfall that flowed down one of the slopes, was White Feather. "Catherine," he called softly, as she approached, his dark eyes shining with a mixture of joy and concern. "I knew you'd come." "How could I not?" she replied, letting the tears finally run down her face as she dismounted and ran into his arms. "There are so many lives at stake, and my heart is where you are." White Feather hugged her tightly, but then pulled away to look into her eyes. "It's been a dangerous road, Redfield." "You're following false leads according to Walking Bear," she reassured him. "But we don't have much time. The epidemic is spreading fast." The Cheyenne warrior nodded, taking her hand. "Come. The sacred waters are nearby. The elders said that only those with pure hearts can find them." As they followed a narrow path up the side of the waterfall, Catherine felt a strange peace envelop her, as if the mountain spirits themselves were welcoming her. Above them, the hawk continued to circle its cry, echoing off the rocks, like a harbinger of hope. The sacred waters flowed from a cleft in the rock, forming a small crystalline lagoon surrounded by multicolored pebbles. The steam rising from its surface formed an ethereal veil in the cold mountain air, giving the place an almost supernatural atmosphere. "The elders say that these waters hold the memory of our ancestors," explained White Feather, as she knelt by the pond. "Each drop carries the wisdom of 1,000 moons." Catherine watched in silence as he performed a ritual of gratitude, burning sacred herbs and muttering words in his native language. The moment seemed suspended in time, as if the world itself had stopped to witness this encounter between the old and the new. The distant sound of voices and hooves broke the spell. Redfield and his men were approaching. "Quickly, White." Feather stood up, pulling out several empty vials from his bag. "We need to collect as much as possible." Working hastily, they filled the containers with the crystal-clear water. Catherine noticed that some of the stones at the bottom of the pond emitted a bluish glow pulsating like submerged stars. "They are sacred crystals," explained White Feather, catching her gaze. "They purify the water and give it healing power. But removing a single crystal would break the magic of the place forever." The voices came closer. Catherine could distinguish Snake's harsh laughter among them. "There must be gold here somewhere," shouted one of the men. "Those savages wouldn't guard a place for nothing." "We have to go," whispered Catherine, her heart racing. "If they find us." A shot cut through the air, the bullet ricocheting off nearby rocks. White Feather pulled Catherine behind a large rock, shielding her with his body. "I know you're there," Redfield's voice echoed across the valley. "Come out now, Miss Morrison, and maybe I won't kill your savage friend right away." Catherine felt White Feather tense beside her. She knew he was calculating his chances. There were at least 6 armed men against the 2 of them. "Go," he whispered, handing her the bag with the vials of holy water. "Follow the western trail. It leads to a sheltered valley where the Walking Bear waits." "I won't leave you," she protested, gripping his arm tightly. "The cure needs to get to our people," he argued, his dark eyes intense. "You're the only one who can do it now." Another shot exploded against the rocks closer this time. Catherine could hear the men approaching from different directions surrounding them. "Last chance," shouted Redfield, "or we'll start shooting for real." Then a different sound cut through the air, a Cheyenne war cry coming from several directions at once. Figures began to emerge from between the rocks, warriors painted for battle led by Walking Bear. Chaos ensued instantly. Redfield's men, taken by surprise, began firing wildly as the warriors advanced with spears and bows. Snake was the first to fall hit by an arrow in the chest. "Run!" Whitefeather pushed Catherine towards a passage between the rocks. "Take the cure. I'll find it later." With tears in her eyes, Catherine obeyed. The sound of battle followed her as she ran down the steep path, the bag with the precious vials clutched tightly to her chest. A cry of pain that she recognized as Whitefeather's almost made her turn back, but Sarah Collins's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes you have to lose something to save something greater. The descent from the mountain was a blur of emotions and exhaustion. When she finally reached the meadow, Catherine found her horse where she had left it grazing peacefully. Riding with difficulty, she set off at a gallop towards the mission. The sun was setting when she spotted the familiar outlines of the buildings. More tents had been erected around the infirmary, more sick people seeking help. "Catherine!" Her father's voice sounded like a prayer as she dismounted in the courtyard. Reverend Morrison ran towards her, hugging her tightly. "I thought I'd lost you." "Forgive me, Father," she sobbed, exhausted. "But I had to go. I brought the cure." In the days that followed, the holy waters proved their power. Mixed with the medicinal herbs, Catherine knew they began to reverse the effects of the epidemic. The sick regained their strength, fevers subsided, and hope shone in people's eyes again. A week later, while caring for the last patients, Catherine heard a commotion in the courtyard. Her heart almost stopped when she saw Whitefeather entering the mission, leaning on Walking Bear. There was a bandage on his shoulder, but his eyes shone with life. "Redfield?" she asked softly as he approached. "He didn't survive the trial of the sacred mountains," replied Whitefeather. "Neither he nor most of his men." Reverend Morrison, who was watching the scene from the infirmary door, snorted for attention. "Mr. Whitefeather," he said formally, "it seems I owe you and your people more than I realized. Not only the cure for our sick, but also the happiness of my daughter." Catherine held her breath, watching her father extend his hand to Whitefeather. The Cheyenne warrior accepted it with dignity. "Your daughter has the strongest heart I've ever known," replied Whitefeather. "She is a bridge between our worlds, just as the sacred waters are a bridge between sickness and healing." That night, while a new kind of peace was being established between the mission and the Cheyenne tribe, Catherine was once again on the banks of the Kansas River. But this time, she didn't have to hide. Whitefeather was by her side, their hands intertwined as they watched the stars reflect off the water. "The spirits were right," he murmured, touching the amulet that still hung around her neck. "You were the one chosen to bring healing not only to bodies but also to hearts." Catherine smiled, leaning back against his strong chest. The waters of the river continued their eternal course, just as the love that had blossomed on its banks would continue to flow, proving that even in the most arid lands of Kansas, in mighty times of greatest adversity, the heart always finds its way home.